tried it, you'll know it. Awful. It's awful. But like I say, intensity is imperative, okay? So us being horrible, how can we make it even more intense? Because that's not intense enough for us. So if you think of it on a track and field perspective, a 30-second interval, you're talking probably about 250 meters for a decent runner. But we know there's track and field events that are shorter in duration. We know there's 200, we know there's 100, we know there's a 60. So how can we then make a 30-second sprint more intense? But balance intensity with recovery so that we're still maintaining the same physiological demand and therefore still targeting the same adaptations. Because like I said before, we could make this 10 seconds long, still give them 3 minutes rest. If we make the sprint 10 seconds long and still give them 3 minutes rest like we do, then we're not getting the same adaptations. Because all we're doing here then is we're just focusing on this, which is appropriate at some point in the training camp and training phase, but not when we're trying to target peripheral adaptations. So what can we do? You might have heard of cluster sets in strength training, okay? So in your traditional strength training setup, this is what you might have up in A, okay? You can replace these figures for, with 6, with 8, with 10, with 12. You could replace this bar in the middle, which is recovery duration, with any type of recovery. So this is only 2 minutes, but you might have 4 or 5 minutes in here. And these numbers might reduce to 2 or 3 or even 1, okay, in terms of repetitions. In cluster sets, you have small number of repetitions. So here, for example, we've got 4 at the top. So there's still 4 repetitions over here, but there's a 15-second rest period within this particular set, followed by a longer rest. So this is a clustering of those 4 repetitions into 2 of a little bit of a rest, and then do 2 again. Okay. And then you can see how that follows on. You can have another type of clustering. So you can have any combination. There's multiple different combinations depending on what you're trying to achieve with this. But here's 1 on, 15 off, 1 on, 15 off. Okay. And this approach has been used quite extensively within strength training. And the paper that we reference here, this is James Stefano's paper. I've done some work with James before. That should be freely available. If not, let me know, I can get it for you. And this is what James says about cluster sets. So when should you be using them? Well, you should be using them when you want to increase velocity and power. When you want to decrease an athlete's RPE, but still get some adaptations and still have that intent. When technique needs to be maintained because you're enabling that partial recovery. When you want to reduce cardiovascular stress, okay, because sometimes if you're going 6, 8 reps, 10 reps, sometimes you're going to get a cardiovascular demand. Sometimes you don't want that, okay, especially if you're looking to learn a new skill. So if you want to reduce those demands. So this is interesting. So I thought cluster sets are interesting because these things that we're trying to do here, especially with velocity maintenance, that's really pertinent to us in conditioning because we want to maintain speed, we want to maintain force, but we still want to get a adaptation from that, and we still need to induce acute demands. So this is very simply how we would do it in conditioning. So we would take our 30-second sprint interval training session and we would chop it up. So at the top there, we've got 30 on, 4 reps. But in clusters, we can do any combination of this. So 15 on, 15 off, 15 on, 30 seconds of work, 15-second recovery, 15 seconds of work, still 30 seconds. Okay? But we're just giving athletes a little bit of time in between. Okay. And if you think back to where we might be on that continuum in the first few slides, is that we're still in that 10-second phase, creeping into that 15-second phase. And then we've got a 10 by 10. So 10 on, 10 off, 10 on, 10 off, 10 on, 10 off. Okay. Yes, Darren.
So obviously you might use these at different phases in the camp, but is there a certain cut-off point in which the velocity reduces so much in the 30 seconds all up that you're like, it's not worth doing them, we'll go down to 15?
No. Because in the 30-second sprints, you should always really start off with those. If you're draining the battery and you're dropping off massively, then from a physiological point of view, that's great. Because they're going to drive adaptation, that's what you want. You just might need to make some pacing adjustments. If you've got an athlete that's dropping off, give them speed targets within the session. That will help them to maintain speed. So that's what you generally do see, people just dropping off just because it's a tough thing to do, tough thing psychologically, tough thing energetically. So you do see people drop off quite quickly. Also depends on what type of athlete they are. Maybe they don't need sprint interval training. Maybe they just need another stimulus. Maybe do something else before you get to that. So here's how we can cluster these intervals. So we did a piece of research a few years ago now. Presented this at the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences conference later last year. So what we had was 7 or 8 runners, actually pretty decent endurance runners. Aerobic capacity was a mean of over 60 mils per kilogram per minute, so pretty fit they were. And we had them run on the curve. And what we're looking for is the differences between a 30-second sprint interval and a clustered version. So the clustered version was 10 on, 10 off, 10 on, 10 off, 10-second clusters. So what we can see on this figure here, we've got peak speed and then we've got reps. So they only did 4 reps of this. The cluster group is in the open circles, and then the sprint interval group, so the 30-second group, is in the black circles. So I haven't put any statistics on these slides here because I think that the figures do tell quite a good story, and we only need to look at the circles and the trends of which way they're going. What you can see, I think, is that for the first 2 reps, peak speeds fairly similar, although there's a higher peak speed in the cluster group. Then they both drop off, but there's a bit of a maintenance in peak speed in the cluster group. So if you just keep referring back in your mind to what James was saying about cluster strength training, actually, that might be something in this here. So they're able to reach the... Yes, Matt?
Why do you think rep 2 is faster than rep 1?
I think they're probably just warming into it, just getting a feel of it. It's probably perceptual. I don't think there's a massive difference in there. I think if you look at the error bars, they overlap quite a bit. So those are 90% confidence intervals, and actually the scale of the figure probably overestimates the difference between the two. There's not much difference there. It's probably like 0.3 kilometers per hour, something like that. And as you can see with the error bars, probably likely no difference. Yeah.
Similarly, it's interesting that the cluster's last recorded speed, doesn't it just drop off from the third one like the other guys?
Yeah.
Anyway, they've gone up. So,
yeah. Again, you can see how large the error bar is. So there is something there, but with this piece of work, we can't be too confident that is a true effect there. If we had more participants, we had 7 or 8, we'd have known a little bit. We might have got a bit more precise information there. But the general trend, I think, is it's not that it's greater, but there's a maintenance we know that peak speed does drop off in clustered sprints, but if we want to maintain speed and power, then this perhaps gives us a solution for that. And then I think you can really see here in terms of when we're looking at mean speed, so we take the peak away and we just look at the mean speed, we can see that speed is preserved throughout those cluster sprints as well. Okay. Speed, so that line at the bottom shows that there's a general trend towards a decrease in mean speed in the clusters, which is what we would see. But then that is preserved in the clustered sprints throughout. In terms of cardiovascular demands, we also had them wearing a gas analyzer. So they were sprinting wearing a gas analyzer as well. Yeah. And they weren't allowed to take it off in between sets. So recovering with that in. So what we can see here is that the cardiovascular demand, so the demand for oxygen, so VO2, as a percentage of their peak was actually greater in the cluster sprint. So when we're talking about trying to find ways to increase intensity but still maintain a cardiovascular demand that is in line with the adaptations that we want to induce, then this is what we're seeing here. We're seeing that their peak percentage of peak VO2 is slightly higher. That's maybe because the volume of the sprint in terms of the sprint time and recovery time is a little bit greater, gives them more opportunity to spend more time close to VO2 max. That's not important here. We're not very good at assessing what's going on at the muscle level. Much better at assessing what's going at the respiratory level at the mouth. So it's not the best approach to take, because we don't have a great idea of what's going on in the muscle, which is what we're looking at here, but it just gives us an indication. Worst case is that it's similar in terms of a cardiovascular demand. What we've also seen is that lactate is a little bit less, but still very, very high, especially in these endurance runners as well, that are not used to producing high levels of lactate and activating those energy systems. We still were able to get up to 16 millimole with these guys. It was killing them. But with the cluster sprints, we had a little bit less because there's that little bit of recovery as well. And I also think the thing with blood lactate is that it only represents the clearance. It doesn't give us an indication of the production at the muscle. We only see what happens in the blood. Okay, so I think with the earlier, with the sprints in the 30-second sprints earlier, we're probably getting more production of lactate, and then that's occurring. That we're seeing that later in the session in the blood. But still, we're just getting this, a relatively high concentration of lactate, but not as high as cluster sprints. And then if you remember, one of the things that James said about clustered strength training was that it is able to reduce RPE, and this is what we found as well, is that RPE is reduced a little bit, slightly, with your cluster sprints versus your sprint intervals, which means that athletes are then ready to push and still maintain that intensity for each repetition. So if we go back to what James was saying about clustered sprints, clustered strength training, and we look at where that lines up to the early research that what we've been doing and what we're doing in the gym, we can definitely see that there's maintenance. Whether there's the change in peak, we're still not quite sure, but definitely a maintenance of speed and power. We're able to increase, because we're increasing that mean speed, there's an increase in training load as well. We're getting a decrease in RPE. And athletes tend to find clustered sprints a bit more enjoyable as well. We can have a bit of a better conversation about technique, sprinting mechanics, because there's that recovery interval as well, and there's more awareness. And then we're getting large rates of force development because of that as well. Okay, so clustered sprints, really, really good if we want to maintain those higher speeds, if we want to preserve mean speed across that interval. We think there's probably similar cardiovascular demands, probably similar demands what's going on in the muscle. We don't have the insights of that yet. We're getting similar blood lactate responses, and we're getting a little bit lower RPE. What we don't know is whether it induces better adaptations. I can stand here and tell you about the acute demands, but there hasn't been any long-term training studies that have investigated the use of clustered sprint intervals versus clustered intervals. So although the signals are pointing in the right direction, we don't yet know whether we're going to get better adaptations from that. We think, but we don't yet know. Okay. So I'm not going to stand here and say, now everyone needs to do clustered sprint interval trains yet. Can't do that. We don't know. I'm not afraid to stand up here and go, we don't know yet, or we were wrong about this. This is what we know now. And we think it's a good avenue to go down when we need to increase intensity. So these are the ways in which we can structure. I talked about it a little bit at the start of the session when we were looking at the ways in which we can put it together. But it's quite simply, you're chopping up that interval. And the easiest ways to chop it up is into 10-second segments, 15-second segments, and 20-second segments as well. Okay, the 2020s are tougher than the others. In terms of the recovery, same as what we do for sprint interval training, and the same amount of repetitions as well. So 4 to 6 reps. That's all we need.